cars, including the two that will be outside, and these in here will have their hoods up, and you'll have an opportunity to look under the hood and see how the mechanics are, the independent suspensions, and the engines, and that's kind of interesting too. We wouldn't do that now because of the size of the crowd, but you can distribute yourselves among the cars that are here. I just really wanted to mention what a treat it was to go to England and accept this award. The International Historic Motoring Awards are based in England. They're sponsored by a couple of banks there at Octane Magazine. And the judges were real people. I mean, this was not a quickie corner store type of operation. The judges, for instance, included Derek Bell, four-time Le Mans winner, Lady Sterling Moss, Jay Leno, and then people from the hobby itself, like the head of the Jaguar Museum, Malcolm Collum, the editor of Octane Magazine, Martin Kauscher, the head of the Fédération Internationale des Collections, Horst Brunig. So there were really good people, and they decided which car should be nominated, a la Academy Award. There were about 10 categories, and 5 nominees for each category were made, and then you went there with your monkey suit on, and when they announced your name, you got an award. It was kind of special. In the big hotel, if anybody gets to London, I'd recommend you go to this hotel. It's only been open since May. It's called the St. Pancras Renaissance Hotel. It's gigantic, 1875 building, and it goes on for miles and miles because it was once the hotel for the leading train station in London. So when trains were coming in at the turn of the century, the trip was so long that you actually went to a hotel after you got off the train, and this was a beautiful luxury place. So anyway, our competition was the National Motor Museum of London in Beaulieu. The only other big museum like this with this type of cars in America was the Peterson Museum in Los Angeles, and then the Jaguar Heritage Museum in Coventry, England, and a museum called the Otto-Kiepen Museum in Germany. So we had some serious competition, and for a 3-year-old museum, it was really great. Now I think we had a little bit of an advantage because the judges were sports car people, and sports cars, as you know, is our thing. So we probably had a leg up because when you talk about Sterling Moss and Jay Leno and Derek Bell, they were racing at Le Mans or collecting these types of cars, so that helped us. Anyway, what we have today is our annual Favorites Award. When we send out our newsletter, we get votes for the cars which people think are the favorites. It turns out, interestingly, that all of the cars voted are post-war cars, despite the fact that about half of our collection is pre-World War II, and some of it's pre-World War I. All of them are sports racing, because that's your choice. We only have sports racing cars here. And there's kind of an integration that we can make very quickly, and I'd rather not spend a lot of time talking today. But there is an integrated theme to what you people have selected as your best cars. The oldest car in this selection is the Ferrari Testarossa. Maybe we can just take a look at that over here. As I say, because of the size of the crowd, you'll have time afterwards to look at it. Why is the Ferrari Testarossa important in this story? The reason it's important is because this car and its subsequent chances won the World Sports Car Championship in 1958, 1960, and 1961. The string of Ferrari victories after 1961 was carried on by the 250 LM that you'll see over there, and that won all the way up to 1966, when, lo and behold, an American car finally won the World Championship, and more importantly won Le Mans, the Olympics car racing, after 45 years of not winning it and not participating very much. So this car has the same chassis, basically, that won the World Championship in 58, 60, and 61. Besides being a great car on the road, it's also damn good looking. There's only a handful of these with this body left, and the original body may be about 12. So this is a real special car. So if we're looking at world champions, we would start with this car that we picked. It was not the number one pick that we made, but it was a serious car. Now, why is this integrated with the other cars?
It turns out that by the mid-60s, Enzo Ferrari was really hated by a lot of people. And sometimes people hate a winner, and sometimes people hate a guy for other reasons, not the least of which is the fact that he was considered a man who would want to race one at every expense, including the lives of the drivers. And he was accused, maybe rightfully so, maybe not, of pitting the drivers against one another, so that ultimately some drivers were killed racing for Ferrari, carrying their speed, taking greater risks, which would not be necessary. One of the guys who was involved in Ferrari racing was, of course, Carroll Shelby. And by the mid-60s, Carroll Shelby kind of hated Ferrari. And he's, of course, still alive, despite a heart transplant and a few other things. And he still hates Ferrari, who is not still alive. And if you hear him interview to this day, he will get very bristly when that name comes up. And in some of his interviews, he's made that clear. So his goal, ultimately, when he started building successful Cobra cars, which was he got a British chassis from the AC company that was not doing well, put a Ford engine in it. His goal was to beat Ferrari. At that time, the GT class, or the closed car class, was just getting very prominent in international racing. And in many cases, the prettiest and streamlined cars were GT cars or closed cars. Now, this is an open car. A GT car, among other things, had a top on it. And the famous GTO was winning and winning and winning. It was a great car. So important that Pontiac named their GTO after the Italian GTO, which is kind of a weird thing. It's like naming your own car to some extent after a competitor. But GTO had such a powerful name because it was winning all the races in Europe. And ultimately he said, we're going to beat Ferrari, and the best way to do it is with the GTO. Now, he had all those little Cobra coupes that your Cobra Roadsters, like this, that you know of, and there are some around and far more replicas. He had Pete Brock design a coupe version. Same chassis, same everything, except it was a coupe. And when they tested that coupe, it went 20 miles an hour faster top speed, based entirely on its aerodynamics and the beauty of that car. That actual car, that is the car that Pete Brock made in the shop of Carroll Shelby in Venice, California, was right over here. And you have to kind of go through again. Excuse me, I don't know any other way to get here.
Yeah, what we're looking at here is what at the time was considered the pinnacle of car design. Even though Pete Brock did not have the advantage of super specialized wind tunnels, he'd do this kind of more or less on the back of an envelope. When they made this body, this actual car, in the shop, it took them a long time. Ken Miles took it out to the track at Riverside, and it was 20 miles an hour faster. At that point in time, because the Ford 289 engine, which was, they made many of those, Ford 289 engine with wear carburetors and some modification, was so reliable, Carroll Shelby thought we could really beat Ferrari. And ultimately, they made 5 more of these, although it took them so long to make the body that they sent the Cobra Roadster chassis to Italy, where they could make, because they were so used to doing handiwork, where they could make bodies faster. So 6 of these cars were made. This is the only one that was made actually in the Cobra factory. And then this car went to Daytona, went to Sebring, and the combination of those 6 cars won the World Championship for the first time. First time ever that we won a World Championship, thanks to Carroll Shelby. This weaves in another story. Why were we not involved in racing? I mean, motor racing was a tremendously popular sport all over the world. Look at NASCAR. NASCAR subsequently became the most popular sport in America. America did not get involved in road racing, and it's a big mystery. But one of the reasons was that the automobile manufacturers kind of like, I don't know, they're kind of like, they all got together and said, racing is dangerous and we're not going to get involved in it. And it might have been simply that they knew that the Europeans could beat them, or they didn't want to spend that kind of money on racing. So
So the AAM, the Automobile Association of America, said, we're not going to race. That at the time was basically the big three, Chrysler, Ford, and GM. However, this was Carroll Shelby making the Cobras, making, 100 cars a year, something small like that. But he advertised a Ford engine. So Ford was getting a lot of juice by the fact he supported Carroll Shelby, who had wonderful opportunities to make a great car, go to Europe and win. Now, if you could buy a Corvette, and the Corvette really didn't make race, the first Corvettes were not really super race cars, but by the early 60s, you could buy a Corvette as a private individual and race it for yourself. You weren't racing it under the aegis of General Motors, so they weren't breaking the rule. But in a way, because Ford was supporting Carroll Shelby, he had a lot of support, and pretty soon, guys who wanted a hot car were buying Fords. They were buying Fords because Shelby cars had Ford engines. This was just before the Mustang, which was introduced, as you know, in the late 64. So the people who were the race people at General Motors had one great car to work with, which was a Corvette. The Corvette, however, was a heavy car, and they couldn't keep up with the Cobra. They needed to make a Corvette that was like a Cobra. So very quietly, George Guntop, the inventor and designer of the Corvette, who admittedly was selling cars that you could go out and buy and race, heavy cars, not too powerful, said, we got to make a car that can be a Cobra, a car that can be Ford. And already they were starting to get a feeling that they might even break this rule about racing. So they made, let's move over here. That is George Guntop, using all the facilities of General Motors at the time, made 5 of these brand sports. By far the most iconic race car, at least sporting race car that General Motors ever built, I believe even to this day. This car had everything technological in 1962 when it was built. The body is 1,000 pounds lighter than a regular bed. This particular car, they came with mostly a high 400 or low 500 horsepower engines. This car had 2 engines in it, but it still has the engine that it raced with, which was an L88 Traco engineered aluminum engine, which has never been really dynoed to my knowledge, so it started putting out around 500 horsepower. And they brought these cars out at some notable races, particularly in Nassau, and the car did very well. This is 63. It did well in another race, and pretty soon the president of General Motors at that time was named Fred Donner, heard about the fact that GM made a car which was racing, and that was breaking the rules of the AAM. So he said, I want those cars crushed, destroyed. Roger Penske managed to seek this car out, and he sold it to George Winterstein, who was actually a mainline guy here in Philadelphia. And George had his own racing organization. He repainted it this color. This is exactly the paint that was put on it in 1965 when George finally got the car and started the racing. At that time, however, there were 2 problems. By 1965, cars were getting rear engines, disc brakes, aerodynamics, and a lot of other stuff. So pure brute power, which is a 500 horsepower engine, give or take, in a light car was not enough. And this car would go very fast on the straight, but unfortunately, the front would lift up, and I have pictures of this car racing with the front wheels not on the ground. It's very hard to steer. George Winterstein is still alive, very much alive. Came here when we acquired the car a couple years ago, and he rode around and told us some pretty hairy stories of what it was like to race a car which wouldn't move right or left when you turned the steering wheel. It's a pretty scary thing. So when we test this today, you'll kind of hear and see the difference. You'll see that the Cobra Daytona Coupe is a stable car with a well-tested 289 engine, less powerful, but the aerodynamics is so much better. This thing is unfortunately a wing, and as pretty as it is, air can get under it. And like a wing, when air gets under a wing, it lifts the car out. So it was an unstable car. Probably if it could have continued to race and been developed when it was built, 1963, it would have probably been a winner. By 1965 and 66, it's raced at Waukegan in 1966. The other cars were blown by rear engines that were very immense. But it's still an iconic car. GM tried to get it back, and it's staying here. Because it fits with our theme of the uninsured original best American car. By 1965, 1966, Ford already decided, as the other companies, we're going to get back in racing. Too much positive, what we say, PR was developing because all these car companies, Ferrari, were getting involved in racing. And they decided to approach Enzo Ferrari, who was now putting out the word. We don't think it was ever really serious. He was putting out the word that I want somebody to support my racing program. Because beautiful Ferrari road cars, as you see, were built only to feed his racing hat. He really didn't care too much about, even though we love these Scaglietti cars, by the way, Mr. Scaglietti died last week. Because beautiful Scaglietti designed and 300 cars were made to sell so that he could put more money into racing. He was having trouble with that, so he was approached by Ford, and this is a great story if you ever want to read the story. The book is called Go Like Hell. It's a wonderful story about how this all happened. It's typical American business. And the deal was, I'll run my racing department, that's Ferrari Turkey, and Ford will support it, and we'll get the combined PR because of our racing ability and our association with Ford. And this was going along fine until Mr. Ferrari met the American lawyers. And as you might expect, that's cleared the deal. Any lawyers in here? that really cleared the deal. But there is a second theme, which is in this book, Go Like Hell, that Mr. Ferrari never really intended to do a deal with Ford. That was his way to kind of insult the Italian government by saying, you know, Ferrari's going to be an American car, and he encouraged Fiat to support his racing habit, and that's persisted ever since. Well, Henry Ford II, who was the guy making this deal, affectionately known as Deuce got very upset, and he said, beat Ford, beat Ferrari, no expense spared. I want you to beat that son of a gun. We're going to show him that we don't need him to be a race winner. At that time, Ford came by surprise had a lot of money. And they could go to a British company, Lola, put a Ford engine in it, and over here we see the results of that. They tried to beat, they went to Le Mans in 1965 with a 289 engine in one of these, and they didn't win. But in 1966, now with a 427 engine, in a car identical to this car raced at 1966 Le Mans. It didn't finish. But very famously, 3 of these came in 1, 2, 3 in the 1966 Le Mans, and the Deuce got exactly what he wanted. He beat Ferrari, and subsequently made another car, which is like the one you see in the exhibit, the Mark IV, one in 1967. The French changed the rules. He got what he wanted, and Mr. Ford got out of the racing business, but the residual Ford cars were taken over by Gulf, or supported by Gulf, and they won Le Mans 1968 and 69, and then never again did we win a Le Mans race for America. So you all voted for these cars, and there is this integrating theme, which has to do with America's kind of xenophobia, not wanting to get involved in international racing. But finally, when they made up their mind up that they wanted to, they produced some wonderful cars, which are these Fords, and sadly, the Corvette Grand Sport never reached its ultimate pinnacle. So there's a very brief history of the late 60s and the late 50s and 60s of America's involvement in racing. And you guys picked the right cars. So thank you.